You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussion, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Laughlin.
Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Friday evening. Here we are doing a discussion on the papacy. Going to be joined by Suan Sonna here in just a moment. Also, Elijah Yasi and Eric Ibarra, co-hosts. So they're all on the show tonight. And discussing the papacy, a little bit of a debate review with Suan and Ubi Petrus, their debate review. So we're going to get a debriefing from him. So that's effectively what we're going to be doing in a somewhat of a just loose dialogue conversation format. Coming up next. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. How are y'all?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Swan, good to have you back on the show. You were on, I want to say a few months ago talking about the papacy. So good to have you back on.
Yeah, it's good to be back. And, this was not planned, but I'm wearing the same jacket that I wore last time. I'm in the exact same place, in my parents' house. So
you are wearing the same jacket, aren't you? I just realized it. I'm probably wearing the same shirt. So
yeah. So, hopefully I'm not wearing the same shirt though, because then that would be really bad,
Well, I wash mine. And I have a couple of them, but I wash them. But
right.
I have to sport the R&T logo on occasion.
That's right.
So, yeah. Well, look, you've been coming up a lot in my feed lately. I've been seeing you doing debates with multiple people, interviews. You had a show with Pints with Aquinas a few days ago. I got the chance to check out some of that. It was really, really good. So you're creating quite the stir.
Yeah, that's a good thing and a bad thing sometimes, I guess, depends on, I've gotten a lot of good reception just from Catholics and even Protestants who are like, wow, I've never heard these arguments before for the papacy, or they really appreciate the fact that I have a very high view of scripture and I love the scriptures. And then, I've had some Orthodox kind of, reach out to me and they're kind of like, wow, I'm really interested in this, or they actually know the Jewish sources and they want to talk to me about the Midrash, the Mishnah, and that sort of thing. So I'm like, hey, that's really awesome. But then, of course, Ortho bros come in and
right, yeah. Yeah, I know how that goes. So, let me ask you this. What exactly got you into the Jewish aspect to the papacy?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question in and of itself. So I guess the place to begin is during my conversion process, one of the things that I kind of knew from my background was I knew about, for instance, how New Testament scholars study the New Testament in its first century context. So I already knew that scholars like Craig Keener and N.T. Wright, and even, people who are Catholic and Orthodox, whatever, they're citing the Jewish sources in order to understand, what is the seed of Moses in Matthew 23, 2-3. Right. Or even the book of Revelation, it mentions the heavenly Sanhedrin. What's that about, right? Or binding and loosing. What do those terms even mean? What do they entail? So then that's one way that I got interested, because I already knew from my apologetic upbringing as a Protestant how to interpret the scriptures and to study them in their context. But I think more importantly for me, just kind of in my own kind of personal self-discovery, I started realizing culture plays a huge part. So for instance, I was listening to, or I was reading a paper by Richard Bauckham on the Epiphanian perspective or whatever, on the Perpetual Virginity of Mary. And, he made this point that in ancient Jewish culture, so for instance, it says that Jesus was firstborn, right? Which seems to imply, at least according to some Protestants, that there were other children that followed from the Blessed Mother. And, Richard Bauckham made the argument, well, if that's the case, then, Jesus would only have younger siblings, right? But then when the brothers and sisters of the Lord rebuke him in public, these would be younger siblings rebuking an older sibling. But in ancient Jewish culture, you wouldn't publicly rebuke your elder sibling. And then I remember for me, I was thinking that makes sense, because I kind of have that cultural background, But then for a lot of my friends who grew up in the West, they were just kind of like, bruh, what? And I started realizing culture plays a huge part. And it's just an inescapable part of how you're going to interpret and understand the text properly or not. And I started realizing, a lot of the claims from the Reformation, I mean, these claims were just so detached from the first century that I started realizing, like, yeah, I think there's something wrong with kind of the Protestant interpretation that I've grown up with.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point. I mean, so you started to see, okay, there might be some insights that we could glean here from discovering the Jewish context. So I like that. That's excellent, and I think that's definitely needed when it comes to the papacy. So hats off to you. And like I said, you're creating quite the buzz. So I really appreciate what you're doing. I think we need more on the papacy because ultimately, I think that's where things boil down to authority. We could talk about other doctrines, but ultimately they're going to go back to the debate on authority. So that's kind of where I like to focus. So again, hats off to you. Well, let's dive in a little bit. So you had a debate recently, or a couple debates with Ubi, and just wanted to get your thoughts on them. Maybe a little bit of a debriefing. What's your impression of them after the fact?
Yeah. So Ubi and I, we only had one debate. And it was 3 hours long. So, and then I think what happened was Louis Reweb, he eventually kept the first opening statements on YouTube for public access. And then the rest of the debate is on Patreon. So if you want to see it, you have to be a patron. But I mean, I had a good interaction with Ubi. I have nothing bad to say about him. Louis Reweb was a great host, and he was telling everybody too, hey guys, be nice to Suan, because when I had Father Deacon Ananias Sorum on my channel, I treated him real well, and they were like, Suan treated our Orthodox deacon really well, so just be nice to him. And then even Louis was making points about when people on your side start acting inappropriately or saying nasty things, and that starts reflecting on your position, or it starts making your side look bad, right? Mm-hmm. So he was saying, guys, let's just not be like this to Suan. And he was even impressed, after my opening statement. I was like, hey, I kind of had to go overtime, so I went 5 minutes overtime, and I said, hey, let me have Ubi also get 5 extra minutes because I want to be fair to him, And then Louis was like, wow, just the professionalism, the presentation. And, that's how I like to keep it, because I don't like, in my YouTube debate review on my channel, there were some people in the comment section who were really being polemical or saying just, craziest things, right? I don't like being mean with people. And, I prefer, if I'm wrong, I want to be corrected and I want to learn, but the interactions that I've been having with some of the ortho bros, as they're called, it's just wild, man. I had an Orthodox friend of mine. She told me she was watching the live stream debate between me and Ubi, and she was seeing the things that people were saying about me. And she said, man, I have never seen anyone in my Orthodox parish ever like this, know? Right. So it was wild. But the debate was good. And, I can get to the nitty gritty of that, but is there anything you want to talk about there real quick?
Well, just to piggyback there, and actually let me do a follow-up question. Did you expect that kind of a reaction from the Ortho Bros, or did this just completely blindside you? I'm just curious.
It blindsided me because I didn't know prior to this, that there was this whole Ortho Bro thing, because I try to stay outside of the drama online and stuff. And I knew there was some drama here and there, but I was like, okay, maybe that's just on Jay Dyer's YouTube or whatever. But then I started realizing, when we did our last interview, just some nasty comments. And then I was like, oh, but maybe this is a one-time thing, right? And then after that, I was like, wait a minute. No, this is a whole movement online, So I started learning the hard way about that.
Didn't we all? So, I ignore it, honestly, at this point. I ignore it, unless somebody has really something useful to contribute. I ignore them, and as soon as I start to see that in the chat or in the comments, I'm blocking them. I used to allow trolls to have a whole lot more breathing room. Not anymore. Just completely, because I'm not going to address what they have to say, and I'm not going to leave their garbage there to infect the channel. So I would just rather, let me just block them and delete them. I know what you're going through. But so tell me overall your impression of the debate itself. Are you happy with it overall, or do you maybe think there were some things that could have been done better?
Yeah, I mean, so I think overall the debate was really good. I think one thing that I wish that maybe I had done better personally. So like, Lewis did a great job hosting. Ubi was a great debate opponent. I just wish that maybe like I knew more about the fathers before the debate, because I started noticing that like, so the debate question was, is the papacy biblical, or why the papacy is biblical, or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like I was ready, for the scriptures. I was
Mm-hmm.
ready for the fathers within living memory of the apostles, because that's
Okay.
generally speaking how the New Testament scholars try to get the earliest interpretations, to try and get the purest and best,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing, right? Um, so then I wish I was more prepared then. And then even like, in my talk with Matt Fradd, I tried to like prepare myself a little bit for that.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, like what I've been finding in like the Jewish sources in the first century, or that at least can trace their sources back to the first century,
Mm-hmm.
what I've been finding there is like, it's a gold mine, right? So I want to keep on digging, keep on
Sure.
finding more and more. But like
Yeah.
eventually I do want to start moving over into like, the schism and everything
Sure.
beyond that. Yeah.
Right. As I understand, you engaged the connection between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22. And I think there's a whole lot to be said there between those two portions of Scripture. I do think there's a connection there internally.
Mm-hmm.
And though you do have some witnesses to this in the first millennium,
Yeah.
it's not as strong as I would like, at least from the data I've seen. Now, a lot of things, there's still a lot of data out there that hasn't been reviewed, so that's not to say that there isn't more, but I'm just saying from what I've seen, there only seems to be a few who really picked up on that connection.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
So I would have, it'd make my job easier, right? If like more fathers were talking about the Isaiah 22, Matthew 16:19 connection. Although, I mean, you do have, maybe a handful at least to recognize that point. And that's why, I really buttressed my argument with different ways of identifying like this typology is definitely there. It's not coincidental. It's not accidental. So I gave like, I don't know if this was in the debate with Matt Fradd. I know with Matt Fradd, I gave like 7 reasons why the typology is definitely there in Scripture. And then also the fact that among like contemporary scholars, it's just almost unanimously recognized that there is a parallel there. So, and then this goes into the other thing too about, whether or not you need something to always be like explicitly spelled out by the fathers, or else you're just not at liberty to interpret or see that there. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So then, yeah, I mean, so what I got worried about was like, for instance, with some Protestants, they're just gonna say sola scriptura, right? And then it seems like with some of the Orthodox, they're only going to go with solus patris, right? So only the fathers. And if you try to like, use your own compelling method, we're not going to listen to it, right? Even though like, there's some people in the comment section who are saying like, no matter how compelling Suan's interpretation is, or, no matter how good the arguments are, we can't accept it because we need more explicit affirmations from the fathers. Whereas I think that, with the argument that I'm giving, it's being traced back to the messianic Davidic kingship of Christ. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you can get more orthodox than that, so to speak, right? You're highlighting something that is at the bedrock and the foundation of the New Testament itself. So I feel like this seems to not be something like totally risky, as if I'm just going out on a limb. There's solid New Testament foundations for the typology that I'm using here.
Sure. Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for the methodology you're using there. Now, what do you think maybe was the strongest position that Ubi offered in refutation to your own?
Yeah, so when it comes to so we debated, so he focused more on the Matthew 16:19 argument, although I also brought up the John 21:15 and 19 point, but he was more prepared, I think, for the former argument. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think he brought up an interesting point about emphasizing, Eliakim seems to be more like a priestly figure than a prime ministerial figure. And if you can do that, then you can kind of say, Peter is more like the high priest on the Sanhedrin. And the high priest on the Sanhedrin, he had to work with the fellow rabbis in the Sanhedrin. And he couldn't do ex cathedra singular pronouncements on his own. But if you get the prime ministerial connection, then you can get this image of, for instance, the prime minister in the Davidic monarchy. He had the power to make rulings that no one under him could override. He could speak in the name of the king. He could be king over over Israel when the king was not immediately present. So maybe the king was like out fighting a war, then he could be the regent of the kingdom. So then, he made that point about the high priest, or Eliakim seems more like the high priest, and he had Jewish backing from like the first, at least literature about the first temple period. So before the temple was destroyed, we know about, for instance, that the priests would have keys, and these keys would be attached to a rock, the foundation stone, so to speak. And before the temple was destroyed, the priests in the temple, they threw the keys. This is in the Jewish literature. They threw the keys up into heaven. And some of the sources say that the hand of God came down and caught the keys and then took them up to heaven. Some of them say like they threw the keys up to heaven and the keys just never came down, right? So there's some difference there. But the point being is that I think he highlighted the priestly aspect of Eliakim, which at least if that totally was the only thing there, then you would get a seemingly more orthodox, not Vatican I ecclesiology. Although I don't think the argument ultimately succeeded, but I thought like, hey, at least he knows the Jewish sources and is taking my argument seriously that there is a typological connection.
Speaking about that, yeah, you can definitely make some connections between the teaching authority that we find in the New Testament with the teaching authority that's there in the Old Testament. But is there not also some disconnect? Because, it talks about Jesus teaching as one with authority, not like the Pharisees, not like them. So since there does seem to be a new kind of, not that it's new kind, I mean, it was always there in God, but I'm just saying it seems to be a different kind of teaching authority as opposed to that which we see in the Old Covenant. Does that maybe then open up a little bit more room for successors to decree something ex cathedra?
Well, so it depends on what you mean. So you were talking about the context at first, like the background context, right? But so what's
He's saying that, okay, the connection that you're making with teaching authority there in the Old Testament wouldn't necessarily allow for this kind of ex cathedra teaching.
Right.
But my question is, since there is somewhat of a disconnect between the New Covenant's teaching authority and that which is in the Old Testament, such as we see there with Jesus, one who teaches with authority, not like the Pharisees. Since you have that disconnect, does that open enough room to where the successor of this new teaching authority, i.e. Jesus, could decree something ex cathedra? Maybe?
Yeah, certainly, because if Jesus is the new Moses, and the role of Moses, first off, in the Old Testament, right? Moses, plays a huge part in Judaism in setting the tone for the authority of the rabbis, the construction of the court and the legal system, right? And then Moses, obviously is a prefigurement for the Messiah that is to come. Even I think Moses even just says that there will be a prophet like me who will come from you, and you will have to listen to him, right? So then if Jesus, as the new Moses, decides to structure his Sanhedrin, his high court, his councils differently, then of course, because he's the Lord, he's at liberty to do that. Although I think also what's interesting about Jesus is that, the point that I would make, right, is that, originally you had like the office of high priest or the Sanhedrin kind of separate, or at least not separate, but distinct enough from the political and secular, so to speak, positions in the Davidic monarchy. Although there was overlap in that, for instance, the prime minister would dress like a priest to at least show that he had some power over the temple. He could do, for instance, he could collect temple taxes and that sort of thing, or manage the economic affairs surrounding the temple. But he could also have political power to make declarations in the name of the king that no one under him could override. And what I propose then is that Jesus in the new covenant, as the new Moses, as the son of David as well, right? So no longer is Moses and David two separate people. In Jesus, they become one person. He begins to blend all of these things together into the new covenant. So eventually you would have, at least I think, I wouldn't be making like this kind of ad hoc break, right? It's like, no, like the difference is anticipated because of the kind of Messiah and person that Jesus is. He's both David and Moses put together and bringing forward both the kingdom of David, and he's also doing the work of Moses.
And let me ask one more question, then I'm going to pass it over to Elijah, and then Eric, and they can ask you some, questions about the debate. On the flip side, what do you think was his weakest argument against your position?
Ooh, yeah. So there was a point where he said basically, he was citing some church fathers, and like the church fathers, he was saying they weren't making these explicit claims that I was, or they weren't making like all the jumps, or not jumps. I don't want to categorize myself that way, but they weren't making the connections from the old to the new covenant like I was doing, in order to get to a Vatican I ecclesiology, so to speak.
Yeah.
And he made the point, well, basically, like, why are you saying these church fathers are wrong? And I'm like, well, I don't have to say that they're wrong, right? Because what I could say is, for instance, like the church fathers, they're laying out important interpretations of scripture. They're laying out how they understood the scriptures. They're giving out very important lessons. And I can just say the scriptures also have something to say as well, whether or not the fathers totally explicitly picked up every single iota of what was in the scripture. So then I didn't think that was a strong, because that makes it into a black and white kind of zero sum. Like, okay, if you're saying that you can see something in the scriptures that the fathers didn't, then you're saying the fathers are wrong, and I don't think it's black and white like that. I think you can have a much more nuanced position and appreciate the authority of both.
Yeah. Elijah, sorry to keep you waiting over there. Did you want to maybe chime in, ask some questions?
Yeah, no worries. Appreciate you for having me on, Michael, and thanks for coming on, Suan. I love your apologetics when it comes to the papacy, the biblical papacy. I don't think there's anything better out there, because you go into such great detail, and I appreciate your work. And it's nice to finally talk to you face to face. I did have one question. I was listening to the debate while I was in the supermarket, and my daughter wouldn't leave me alone, so I wasn't really paying as much attention as I would like. But I did hear something, and I'm big on the Pope working with his brother bishops, and I did hear you mention something about that on a typological level, something in the Old Testament where I'm not sure who it was, but he worked with his brother bishops, not bishops, but fellow brothers. Can you talk about that a little more, unpack that a little bit if possible?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on what the precise reference is. So for instance, I talked about like Joshua in the Old Testament. So basically in Jewish tradition, during the time of Jesus, and even after the time of Jesus, we see these references about Joshua receiving the throne of Moses, and the term throne is used. So I got someone accused me of like using the throne, the word throne, in order to like convey this monarchical aspect that wasn't there. But no, some of the Jewish sources call it a throne, others call it a seat or cathedra, right? And basically the idea is that after Moses died and he handed his authority over to Joshua, it says, he seated Joshua on his throne, on his seat. And then what Joshua ended up doing was he decided how the power would be distributed after that. Because when it says some, right, it's talking about how basically Joshua cannot like usurp what had been previously ruled by Moses. So that's why it says some of the authority of Moses in Deuteronomy 34:9 was given to Joshua. And then Joshua in Jewish tradition, especially the Avot of Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Natan was alive in the 2nd century within the period of living memory of the apostles. Whether or not he knew them is a different question, probably didn't. But the point is that he had access, this Rabbi Natan, to the 1st century sources. And he's talking about how after Moses died, Joshua decided how the power would be distributed.
I appreciate that. That was a good answer. As far as the patristics go, going back to that, what I think is happening here, and I think that they have a fair point there as far as the fathers, because a Protestant can approach us and say, here's my interpretation according to the exegesis that I did myself. Mm-hmm. And then to counter that, as Catholics, we show the father's interpretation of that scripture, to say, well, it's your interpretation versus the father's interpretation. But here with the Protestants, it's the interpretation of the fathers contradicts the Protestant. And when I say Protestants, I don't mean all Protestants. Mm-hmm. As we know, there's divisions out there on that. But some of the Protestants, the fathers contradict the interpretation of some of the Protestants, right? But in this case, it seems like your interpretation did not so much contradict the fathers. It was sort of like the fathers are silent, if they are silent about it. I do know that there are some Syriac fathers who talk about that. Mm-hmm. Would you think that's a fair point to make, and also and to kind of piggyback on that, the Syriac fathers themselves, that's where you're going to find this typology.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we barely have any of their works translated. And I confirmed that with a Syriac, a friend of mine, and he told me that there's barely any of the Syriac translations out there. There's some that are hidden in monasteries, like 4 or 5 monasteries, that even the people that are in that monastery haven't even like opened or touched. So and this is an argument from silence, but would you say that's a fair argument there?
Yeah, I mean, and just to steelman kind of the objection, you know, so for instance, they would say for like, you know, a heretic would often say like, hey, I have this interpretation, right, of the scriptures, and they could, you know, they would talk about how the heretics in the councils, they could cite the scriptures left and right. But then like when it came down to the backing or the prior tradition, it just wasn't there. So then the thing is, I don't want to be in the same camp as those heretics, right, who just say, oh, I can just go to scripture. I don't want to be like Martin Luther or John Calvin, right? But then the difference, right, I think the clear difference is that like when we're talking about the messianic identity of Jesus and like the messianic expectations that were there, I mean, I think this is in a total, I think it's in a totally different ballpark, right? Because we're talking now about something that was there in the first century, this consciousness of the Davidic kingship of Christ, which makes it not something so novel as just some, you know, it's not novel, so to speak, right? It's something that seems to be planted and already anticipated there in the scriptures. And then I like the point that you made about like, it seems as if the fathers are just silent, but it doesn't seem to be an outright contradiction. And that's why too, like, you know, people talk about why arguments from silence are often really risky to make, because there are all sorts of reasons why we think a source would mention X, Y, and Z, but then they just don't end up doing that. So, you know, I referenced the work of the philosopher Timothy McGrew on this particular issue, and he goes after example, does like a Bayesian kind of argument too about just why you need to be really careful with arguments from silence. So yeah, I would say in response, I don't think we're in the same ballpark as like the heretics, because we're talking about something that the New Testament already establishes. So we're within the boundaries of the New Testament and the first century apostolic witness and typology. And then the second thing is that, what was it? Like, I think arguments from silence are tenuous at best.
I appreciate that. And then my last point here is not a question, and I'll pass it on to Michael or Eric there. I just wanted to say congratulations on your debate. It was great, and you did a great job, and I really commend you there.
Yeah, Elijah, when you said like I was probably the best defender of the papacy from scripture, I almost fell out of my chair. I was like, bruh, like.
Well,
yeah.
it's because like when it comes to Catholicism and the papacy, people just point to 3 passages, right? Matthew 16, Luke 22, and John 20, and then we go to the fathers, right? And then we emphasize the fathers. Where you're like, all right, let's put a pause on the fathers for just 1 minute. There's a lot more we can look at, and that's what you do, and that's what I appreciate.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, Elijah.
Eric, what kind of questions and comments did you have? Let's pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Having a lot of technical issues. Can you?
It's breaking up pretty bad. Yeah. On my end, I guess it is for y'all too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's definitely breaking up. Maybe if you want to try exiting, maybe coming back with cell phone or another laptop, it might work a little bit better. Could be the internet connection. I know sometimes if you're not actually hardwired through an Ethernet cable, it'll do that. Mm-hmm. Wi-Fi is terrible for streaming. So, yeah, just word to the wise. If you're streaming, try to connect that Ethernet cable. Yeah. So, I mean, are there some things that maybe you learned after the debate that you felt, oh, you know what, I should have said this during the debate? What do you think?
You know, I don't know if okay, well, there was one point that I wish I'd like emphasized more. So for instance, in the debate, we were debating, you know, the house of David. So that particular reference that's in Isaiah 22:22. So the key to the house of David. Yeah. Ubi was saying that the key to the house of David is really to the temple, and hence this is emphasizing the high priesthood of Eliakim and not his prime ministerial authority, right? And I was like, okay. And then, you know, he had some like Jewish arguments about like the keys being used in the temple and how like the same word for, you know, house is used to describe, you know, temple, right, in the Old Testament. And then I started looking more closely. And first off, I cited Roland DeVoe, and he wrote a book called Ancient Israel, Its Life and Institutions. And he talks about how in the book of Genesis, when Joseph is made the vizier of Egypt, or basically the prime minister, it says, I think in Genesis chapter 41, if I'm not mistaken, that Pharaoh made him the master of the palace, made him master of the house, or the steward of the house, or, you know, whatever it is. I think DeVoe's translation is master of the palace, right? The same phrase, master of the palace, is used to describe Eliakim and the other prime ministers like Jotham, Ahishar, Shebna, and so on and so forth. So then I wish I had like emphasized that part of the quote, because then it would make it clearer that when it says like the master of the palace, it's not talking about the temple, it's talking about the Jerusalem palace. And in particular, I looked at the scholarship on like the house of David, and that clearly refers to, in the Old Testament, you know, this is like kind of the unanimous scholarship that at least I was finding, right? House of David refers to the Davidic line. So the key of the house of David is not referring to the temple, it's referring to the kingdom of David, right? So I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom of David. So I wish I had emphasized that point, because then that would have like kind of cut down to the bone of what the argument is. Because especially like, you know, DeVoe and I think Nancy M. Tischler in her Encyclopedia of Biblical Imagery, they both talk about how the office of vizier got translated over into the Davidic monarchy as the office of prime minister. And I remember too, like, you know, there are people online talking about like, you know, Eliakim was not a prime minister. And I was like, man, like the scholarship is just unanimously against that. Like, you know, so they'll talk about, for instance, you know, John Oswalt in his New International Commentary on the Old Testament, chapters 1 to 39 on Isaiah. John Oswalt, and that commentary is considered, at least from what I've heard, like the leading commentary on the book of Isaiah. And he talks about how Eliakim is a prime minister. And it says, you know, he talks about how like, you know, Eliakim wears a tunic and a girdle and a sash, right? Because he gets basically Shebna's when Shebna's demoted to the position of like a secretary. And that commentary says, and this should not be seen as Eliakim like usurping the power of the priests. So then when he says that, I notice that he's saying like, okay, you know, the office is priestly, but it's primarily this prime ministerial office. That's what John Oswalt is saying in his commentary. And then I started looking at other sources that were talking about how Eliakim was in charge of the defense forces in Israel, how he represented the king before, I think it was Babylon, and, you know, on all these different points. So basically I was like, yeah, Eliakim was a prime minister. Like if you have to, and this is not to Ubi, right, but to someone like the ortho bros who are on my, you know, in the comments, just repeating this over and over. You know, I cited the scholarship. I cited like, you know, like I cited the scholarship. I brought like 4 different quotes from 4 different sources, and I'm just like, you know, if you have to keep on saying this in order to sustain your position, then, you know, you have to literally deny like historical facts about the Old Testament to get away with like that interpretation. Although, you know, I'm not saying this about Ubi, because I think Ubi, like, I think he had good intentions and he was actually citing the Jewish sources. I just think he's wrong on this point, and that's something we should like hash out further. But yeah, the other guys though, like after I presented the arguments and the scholarship, they ought to know better.
Eric, are you able to hear us any better this time?
Oh man, Eric.
Yeah. I think it's the internet connection is what it is. Yeah. It's the internet connection. Needs to use a cell phone. Every now and then I'll have to break out the old cell phone to join a stream. You know, you're appealing a lot to scholarship, but a lot of these scholars don't agree with your conclusions when it comes to the papacy. How do you explain that?
Yeah, okay. So for instance, a lot of the Protestant scholarship, okay, and I get kind of annoyed too when people say like, oh, this is Protestant scholarship, right? Like, well, these are scholars who happen to be Protestant, but they've studied, you know, archaeology, the ancient Near East, they've studied the relevant sources, you know, so I don't think it's fair to dismiss anybody just because they're Protestant, you know. And I don't think it's fair to dismiss anybody because they're Orthodox or because they're Catholic, right? I think you need to assess the arguments independently and not do ad hominem attacks. But basically, what they will mainly say is they'll say like, okay, you know, some of them will make the point like, okay, this is talking about administrative authority in Matthew 16:19. The Urban's Bible Dictionary edited by Alan C. Myers and others, just straight up calls Peter the head of the church, the authority as the head of the church, right? So, they'll say all these things. And then eventually, R.T. France, I think in his commentary on Matthew, he'll eventually say things like, but this power is shared in Matthew 18:18. So the key getaway from like the sole prime ministerial image or power is Matthew 18:18. That's what they will appeal to in order to avoid having this power singularly concentrated onto Peter. But they will acknowledge the prime ministerial connection and the image of administrative authority and authority over the church.
And, and this might be something that you want to comment a little bit on, Elijah. You're going to hear the argument brought up, and it sounds like it was brought up here by Ubi, or at least an emphasis on the Pope isn't really able to, or shouldn't be able to teach by himself apart from the other bishops, and making a connection between certain things that are going on in the Old Testament with teaching authority there. Could you maybe comment a little bit about that? And then also I want to get your thoughts on Elijah's comments, Suan.
Yeah, no, so I have like 5 hours of videos. Well, I have 2 videos that are 5 hours long on my own page that I unpack this question. Is the Pope supposed to act alone in the context of papal infallibility, which is what the debate was about in the context of Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. So the answer is, if the Pope does act alone, that's a morally sinful thing for him to do, right? If he acts in opposition to his brother bishops. So that's not supposed to be this way. It's not supposed to work that way, right? And what I think the East are expecting us to show is from history is where the Pope stands up and acts alone and everyone obeys him. Well, that's not what we believe is supposed to be the way. We don't believe that that's how it's supposed to work, because both the episcopate and the papacy are both divine institutions, and they work together. When there are issues in the church, they work together to solve those issues when it's a universal matter. And so they're stuck on this idea in Vatican I, where it says that the decrees of the papal ex cathedra's are irreformable and not from the consent of the church, right? And so we have to ask the question, what does that mean? And the way the East understand this is that the Pope can act without the consent of the church. Well, that's not what he's saying. That's not what Vatican I is saying. What Vatican I is saying is that the consent of the church is not what makes the decree infallible. Not that the consent of the church is not necessary. It's just not what makes the decree infallible. It's irreformable and infallible because of the gift that Christ gave to Peter and gave to the church of the papal infallibility. And so it's Christ preventing Peter from falling into error when he speaks ex cathedra that makes it infallible. Now the question is the consent of the church necessary to be behind papal decrees? Well, Vatican I says yes, because it says that the Pope cannot make up new doctrines, right? If he can't make up new doctrines, then he has to only decree what has always been taught. And what has always been taught, obviously it would be taught by the bishops in the past and in the present. And that's why if you look at the Relatio of Gasser, he says that the present preaching of the magisterium is a rule of faith, even from pontifical definitions. It's a rule of faith, present preaching of the magisterium, not just past. But then he says it can in no way be deduced that it is an absolute necessity to include the consent of the church, where by consent, I mean it's not absolutely necessary for the Pope to go poll the bishops every time, because he can know this consent by just, like I always give this example, Pope John Paul II, when he decreed on female ordinations, he said no to that question. He didn't go poll the bishops because it's such a ridiculous question to ask. Of course we can't do that. So there's no reason to go waste their time. Scriptures and tradition, it's what the bishops all have always taught and what they currently teach. So he doesn't have to go ask them, hey, do you guys believe this? Yeah, we do. That's obvious, right? But when there are matters where it's not so obvious, he does go and poll the bishops, like with the Immaculate Conception and with the Assumption of Mary. Even though you would say those are obvious, he still went and polled them, right? And it just goes to show this is the way it's supposed to work. It's the Pope working with his brother bishops. And so last thing I'll say is the reason why Vatican I did not include that the Pope has to go and seek the consent from the bishops is because it was refuting the heresy of Gallicanism, which says that the Pope can't do anything without getting permission from his brother bishops, right? And so because the Vatican was refuting that question, it can't put that in the definition or else it's going to confuse the faithful. And another reason why it can't put it in the definition, this will be my last point, is if you include that in the definition and then there is a division in the church, there's bishops believe, 50% of bishops believe A and 50% believe B. The Pope doesn't have an actual majority consensus here, right? Or a consent, because it's split. So what is he supposed to do? And so Gasser says it's ridiculous to include that in the definition, even though that's the way it's supposed to work ordinarily, but we can't include it because the Pope is sometimes going to work with the church being divided, and where Rome sides with, whether it's A or B, that's going to be the truth. But notice he is siding with his brother bishops. He's not siding with all of them, but he's at least siding with A or B. He's not making up option C, because there can never be a time where the Pope is the only Orthodox bishop in the church. So either A or B are going to be right in those instances. And we've seen that throughout church history.
And by the way, if people look into the history behind Humane Vitae, it's definitely confirming what you just expressed. Suan, did you have any comments on that before we go to Eric?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, like Elijah Yassi's videos, I think I've watched the first two in response to Ubi on papal infallibility. And then you answered recently, if the Pope's infallible, then why do we need ecumenical councils? All three of those videos, brilliant. And they helped me a lot because, coming into the church at first, I kind of thought okay, so we're talking basically, just like the Pope is just, I knew that the Pope was going to be protected from error. Right. But then when I read lines the definitions of the Pope are irreformable and, are beyond the consent of the church, I kind of thought oh, OK, so he doesn't need the consent of the church. But then you clarified very importantly, especially with Gasser, what he was saying in the gift of infallibility. And I just want to point out, too, for instance, in Acts chapter 5, which is an argument that I used in my, own scholarship on this issue. When Peter rebukes Ananias and Sapphira, he's rebuking them for violating the teaching of the apostles. But when Peter rebuked Ananias and Sapphira, God specifically backed his binding and loosing power with death, right? So he struck down Ananias and Sapphira. And then I mentioned before, how it says, and, all the people heard and were afraid. And then it says in verse 11, all the entire church heard and was afraid. And I was making that as a reference back to Peter basically possessing the throne of Moses. Because when the throne of Moses was established in Deuteronomy 17:13, it likewise says that if you disobey the presiding judge or priest, then that person will be put to death, and then all the people will hear and be afraid. So, this was a point that other rabbis have brought up, that other people have noticed, other New Testament scholars. But yeah, so when Peter did that rebuke, it was for or on behalf of the other brother apostles, right? Or even in Acts chapter 15, when Peter speaks on behalf of the church, and basically at the end of his, speech, he says, we're saved by grace, but through faith in Jesus Christ and not by circumcision, right? When he uses the we, he's speaking on behalf of the entire church. But then at the beginning of his declaration, he says, the Lord chose my mouth, right, to be the one to bring the Gentiles into the church and open it up to them. So then, on one hand, Peter's saying basically all the apostles assembled here together at this council, they're participating in his mission to open the church up to the Gentiles. And then he says at the very end, I'm speaking on behalf of the entire church. And then James, in communion with Peter, confirms his decision, right? So the point here is that you can have this incredible view. I don't want to say it's incredible, but you can have this view of Vatican I and still have this other view about the cooperation and consent of the church and so on and so forth. So it's not as if the Pope is speaking against the church, right? He is speaking for the church and on behalf of the Orthodox bishops. He's with them, working together with them. But yeah, in a sense, though, the authority is uniquely in him, right, to make these ex cathedra pronouncements and to settle the matter, right? But it's not as if he is totally at war with his brother bishops and he's the only one standing alone. That's the wrong way of viewing it.
Yeah, what you're saying there is also backed up by John Paul II, kind of being the voice for the bishops in some instances. Eric, let's come to you. What kind of questions and comments did you have? I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I tried a new laptop that I got. I spent a lot of money on it, and that was not working. Tried my old laptop, that wasn't working. Tried my cell phone, didn't work. So I grabbed my wife's cell phone, and I got off our Wi-Fi, which is what it is. My Wi-Fi is not. So we're just going off of her provider. So, sorry about that. I'm terribly sorry. I tried. Suan, thanks for coming on the show. I'm happy to have you on. And, I appreciate what you're doing. All the work that you're doing is very, it's intriguing. I'm learning from it because I didn't really look into this much when I was studying the papacy. So it's certainly something for me to get educated on.
Yeah, dude, Eric, I really appreciate it. Like, I'm a huge fan of all you guys. So like to be here in this chat with you, I don't feel worthy, but you know.
No, we're fine. I mean, I'm we've been chasing down, a good amount of topics for a long time. That's why Michael and I when we first started the show, we just had so many things that we felt needed to get talked about. So papacy being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, is there? I may have missed a lot. I do apologize. Was there anything you'd like to want me to comment on, or would you like to broach that from what from what Elijah and Michael brought up?
I mean, so I talked to you, Eric, before I came on the air. Like, I just want to ask you guys some questions to help prepare me now for so for instance, I'm still like focused on the 1st and 2nd century because, I really like, getting to the heart of what was going on in the 1st century and really beefing up the scriptural case as much as possible. Right. So, I mean, I'm still finding things out that are just incredible. So, for instance, I found out the other day that the power to bind and loose includes the power to issue anathemas. And like, this is something that the Pharisees had done. And I was just like, whoa, I didn't know that. Maybe you guys did, but I didn't know that. I discovered that for the first time the other day. Or for instance, like, we talk about the consensus of the fathers, right? What the fathers teach. And then in Judaism, they have this concept called Shazal or the Hazal, or even it's called the Razal, right? And basically, they talk about like if the fathers in the Talmud, which are the commentaries on the Mishnah, if they're all unanimously teaching something, then that can't be wrong, right? And then you'll have some contemporary Jewish persons commenting like, doesn't this sound like infallibility and like Catholicism? Or like, doesn't this sound like like the doctrine of papal infallibility or whatever? Or then, I mean, there's a debate right now in the Orthodox Jewish community about whether or not the Shazal is infallible, right? Because there's sometimes when the Talmud uses kind of outdated science. Or for instance, like when people talk about the doctrine of apostolic succession, and then I started looking into like the 1st century and the 2nd century, right? And I saw that in order to be a valid priest and judge during the time of Jesus, right, in the Sanhedrin, one, you had to be ordained in Palestine, but then specifically, you had to be able to trace your ordination through Joshua and to Moses. And if you didn't have that ordination background, then you didn't have a valid priestly or judicial ministry, basically. So then when Irenaeus talks about, producing the list of bishops, that's not just a rhetorical device against the heretics. That's not just a cultural or, reputational device, right? He's actually citing something that the original apostles probably taught because they knew the Pharisees, and especially Paul, was a Pharisee. He never gives up that title. And then even in the Acts 15 council, I realized too that some of the early Christians, they still identified with the Pharisees, right? So I was like, whoa, okay, they definitely had an influence. Or even this idea of like councils and synods. That's something the rabbis were doing in the 1st century, right? So when all these, when all these people were complaining like, Suan, why are you bringing up the Jewish sources? I'm like, do you know how indebted to Judaism our faith is? Or I don't know if indebted is the best word, but like our whole system of the fathers, of the councils, of infallibility, like the anathemas that we can issue, that can all be traced back to the 1st century, to the rabbis during the time of Jesus. So, like that's an incredible bonus for our side, especially when we go up against Protestants, you know, who think that these are ideas that we invented. No, these are things that the first apostles, the first Christians would have been aware of. Yeah, but okay, yeah. So Eric, back to you. So
No,
I wanted to ask you.
that was a
Yeah,
great point you made there, because I know that when you read patristic scholars today, sometimes they try to say that Saint Irenaeus was just appealing to a practical tool.
yeah,
You know, so what's the best way and what's the most likely method? Oh, a succession might work. So yeah, I like the way you
yeah.
talk
I
about
mean, it's incredible because I don't know if anybody else has made this connection yet. So like I actually stumbled on it by accident because I was reading Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, and then he mentioned how, you know, the Jewish practice of ordination, semika, which comes from the Hebrew used in Deuteronomy 34:9 when Moses laid his hands on Joshua. Uh, and I was like, wait a minute, this changes everything. Like if this was already in Judaism during the time of Jesus, and then also I started learning about like you know, the belief that the high court could actually enact the rulings of heaven. And that's why Jesus mentions the backing of heaven in Matthew 16:19 and Matthew 18:18, because this was an image that the people would have understood, and it conveys basically infallibility. It basically conveys that the heavenly court, or basically the court of God, was backing the rulings on earth. So like you know, that just blew me away.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to say that I caught the last end of what Elijah was saying about, you know, the Pope working with the bishops. And that's important because um, a lot of Orthodox and Protestant and sometimes even Catholics, when they read Vatican I, they you know, they close the book, and when they look to the Pope, they're expecting, you know, C3PO, Bishop Cyborg Relations, you know, and or Johnny Five, depending on what you know, what movie you watched back in the day. I'm showing my age here. And that's not really what we teach. You know, the full capacity of the power that was given to Saint Peter was not intended for papal isolationism, is what I call it, where the Pope is supposed to isolate himself and you know, sort of do everything without the incorporation of the episcopate. And that kind of goes into the patristic understanding of Matthew 16, because you get a lot of Orthodox today who are finally coming around to seeing that, at least from Cyprian, that the rock there is Peter. But what they'll say is it's simply the episcopate. And so there's no Roman singularity to extract out of it. It's just an episcopal commonality. It's something that applies to every single bishop. But that's that explanation runs out of gas very quickly, because we start to see claims by major saints, doctors, and theologians in the patristic era that see a Roman particularity from Matthew 16, as it is adjoined to the episcopal priesthood. So it's not something that's completely disjoined from the episcopal college. It's something that is intricately connected to it. And so this is one of those nuances that I don't think the Orthodox are seeing when they look at Matthew 16 and they see simply the high priest. So the bishop of Carthage, the bishop of Ephesus, the bishop of Rome, the bishop of Thessaloniki, they're all kind of just equal sharers to one Petrine priestly ministry. And that, like I said, that runs out of gas with some of the data that you could read that's quite readily available to anyone.
Yeah, and you know, Eric, if I can say two things real quick, like you know, one of my friends, he showed me a book. I think it was called like The the tradition of the Syriac tradition in the Church of Antioch or something like that, and it's a public access book that you can find online, and some people will say like, okay, maybe some of these sayings are forgeries or whatever, that's what I consulted Ubi just to fact check some of these, and he said some of them might be sketchy, so take it with a grain of salt, right? But I was looking at some of the Syriac fathers, and they just they'll say things like, for instance, the Roman pontiff does have a unique claim to the ministry of Peter, right? Or for instance, they'll talk about how like the Roman pontiff is the superior patriarch, and all the other patriarchs are in a sense his inferior or ought to obey him, right? I mean, so I remember when I went into the debate, so because I didn't know like a whole lot, and also I'm kind of intimidated because it's a huge history, and hundreds and thousands of pages written by the fathers, I don't even know where to start really. That's why I'm kind of restricted to the first 2 centuries, right? For my sake. I started realizing that I was being too humble, maybe, or I was being humble because I didn't know like all of the everything, right? So then when I went into the debate, I kind of said, yeah, I mean, so you have doctrinal development, blah, blah, blah. But then I started realizing, wait a minute, no, wait, the fathers are saying way stronger things than I thought they were going to say, because I was kind of led to believe, largely because of like, just what the Orthodox some of them have said online to me, that like, oh no, the case is going to be a lot weaker. So then I was surprised, right, by the claims that were made by the fathers. And the second thing I wanted to talk about, Eric, is like, so for instance, like if you go off of this like solus patris view, right? So you're going to only appeal to what the fathers have said. I mean, wouldn't that also get you in like, because the fathers, if they're saying really strong claims over here, but then they're saying some claims that sound more orthodox, then you're going to get like a really kind of, let's say, messy and kind of muddy view on what's really going on, right? So it seems to me that at least the doctrinal development hypothesis, that would kind of anticipate that you would see the stronger claims here, but then of course they'd be contested, right? But that's part of the development going on. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Michael, did you want to go first on that one?
Sorry, I had to unmute there. I don't know how anybody who takes a, father's primacy kind of view when it comes to discerning doctrine, although there's definitely a place for the fathers in discerning doctrine in Catholicism, right. But a patristic primacy kind of view, I don't know how anybody is Eastern Orthodox who maintains that position. I mean, because the veneration of images, though, you can find some things here and there, especially, from 7th century onwards. But prior to that, it's going to be a pretty tough battle. And in fact, you will find a lot of things in the fathers that would be contrary to it. So it seems to be pretty difficult at that point. So I don't see a whole lot of consistency there. That doesn't mean the fathers are of no use. No. There's definitely an appeal that can be made. And, I've talked a lot about Father Emmanuel Duranzo on the show. He was a pre-conciliar manualist, although also post-conciliar manualist. In fact, he was the very last one to write a theological manual as far as the manualist tradition is concerned. Doing so even right after the Second Vatican Council, and he'll note that one of the places of theology is the fathers, and he goes through the principles to determine how to determine whether or not something is taught with a consensus by the fathers. He goes into that and gives some very good principles, although briefly they are very, very helpful. So you'll see that in our tradition. I'm not saying you don't go to the fathers. I mean, clearly you have Thomas Aquinas and many of the scholastics doing just that. But this kind of fathers alone kind of an approach that some, not all Orthodox, but I'm just saying some Orthodox take, I don't see how it's tenable when it comes to the veneration of images. But that's me. Maybe there's a way to still, square that circle. Eric, did you have any comments? Elijah, either one of y'all?
Yeah, you can go ahead, Eric, if you want. I can go after.
Yeah, I think it's I think that it's one of the assumptions that I write about in my book is that we look to the church fathers like there's the Eastern fathers and then there's the Western fathers, and that, of course, that's completely legitimate, you know. But there's a sense in which it's not legitimate when you take it too far.
Mhm.
So, for example, in the early church, you had Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles, and Saint Paul can refer to their differences, no problem. But when it comes to being in Christ, there is no Jew, there is no Gentile, right? So, in a sense, when in Christ, there is no Eastern fathers versus the Western fathers. They're all the fathers.
Mhm.
They all come from one wellspring, speaking through one Holy Spirit. This was the argument that was made by Saint John of Damascus when he was defending the veneration of images, and it was the argument that the Greeks used at the Council of Florence when they were trying to convince Mark of Ephesus, for example, of why they needed to subscribe to the decrees outlining the filioque and other things like papal primacy, because it was clearly in the fathers. Maybe it was more clear in the Western fathers, but Bessarion of Nicaea said it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's clear in the Western fathers and unclear in the Eastern fathers. The Western fathers are just as much fathers. So I think that's important, that, taking both sides, heck, throw North in there. You've got English and, South, technically speaking, for the North African bishops, but all of them have to be taken into consideration. But the other thing is, one of the facts that we had to come to grips with in historical criticism is that not every father agreed with each other, and this was something that maybe a traditional Catholic or a traditional Orthodox 150 years ago, he may plug his ears before he hears something like that, because there was just such a high view of the church fathers. But look, hindsight's 2020. We can read all the fathers now. We could see where the banana peels were, where they slipped, where they made mistakes. And so at that point, it makes it a little difficult, because which father counts now when there's a dispute between them, and obviously there's some practical rules like St. Vincent gives, majority, obviously the most prominent, the most antique, et cetera, et cetera. But I think with the papacy issue, as I write in my book, it comes it comes darn close to just like almost the middle in many instances, where the Eastern fathers are ready to thumb their nose at Rome. And but you have some voices in the East that say, no, we can't do that, because if we do that, we'll go to hell. So, but at the same time, so that's a difficult storm to weather, because now it's like, well, which side is right, and how can we sustain the principle that the fathers on both sides are equally fathers? At the end of the day, I think St. John Henry Newman had it right, and because he spent years in the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, scouring the church fathers. And one of the things he noticed that was so debilitating to the whole Oxford project was that you had fathers saying different things. And so for him, it was so important that there is a living voice, and that living voice has to be equipped with the kind of visibility that only something like the Catholic doctrine of ecclesiology can provide.
Yeah, if you don't mind too, I just want to say something real quick. Like, in the debate review on my channel, I also talked about, like, when there's a worry that sometimes, like, there's like an overemphasis on the fathers, and maybe that wasn't the best wording, but I think like there has to be nuance, right? Because sometimes, like, the way that some of the Orthodox view like the fathers is like, oh no, they're unanimously like not talking about like making any incredible claims about the Roman pontiff or whatever. And then I started looking and I was like, wait a minute, okay, there has to be more nuance in this narrative than what I've been given, And I guess like because I didn't know any better, I was just like, okay, and kick the dust or whatever. But
Yeah, no, it's a learning process, and maybe you'll have a second opportunity.
Elijah, I think you had some comments there.
Yes, I do. Going back to what Eric was talking about, East versus West, the emphasis on the Eastern Fathers from Eastern Orthodox. I think the reason why they do that is because if you reference a Western Father on the papacy, they would say, well, of course they would say that on the papacy because that's their patriarch and they're underneath him. But I would answer back and say, well, we have to take a look at what they're actually saying. They're not saying that because he's my patriarch, I obey him or I go to him. They're saying that he is the teacher of the world, and they're saying like because of his Petrine authority, and they're making it in the context of the teacher of the universal church, not just the Western church, right? So, I mean, Eric brings up a really good point there. Now, as far as, references about the papacy and the debate, I think what they were looking for, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what they were looking for was the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16 from the fathers, right? Not so much the papacy from the fathers in general, right? But of course, they're both important. But if it's the papacy from the fathers, I mean, we can go through so many things. I mean, you can look at Pope Leo's Sermon 3, paragraphs 2 and 3. You can look at Pope Leo's Sermon 5, Pope Leo's 14th letter, paragraph 12. I mean, these, and these, when you read these, you're just looking at them and you're like, wow, this makes Vatican I look really tamed. It's just, he just goes all out. He has no filters as far as his authority goes. But one of my favorites, and both Michael and Eric are really aware of this, is Saint Stephen of Dore at the Council of or Synod of 649, where we're always being accused of this idea of, we're always looking at Peter, Matthew 16 and the keys, and they're like, they call it, the more Orthodox call it Marquise, M-U-H, Marquise, I guess, whatever. Like that's all we talk about, or the Petrine or Peter syndrome, right? Well, here's Stephen of Dore, Saint Stephen of Dore, with that Peter syndrome and Marquise thing. If you don't mind, Michael, can I read that? Because I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's fine.
And this is an Eastern Orthodox saint as well as a Catholic saint. So he says, as a result of their troubling the whole Catholic Church in this way, in the words of the Blessed Jeremiah, we have been put to shame because we heard reproach against us. It has covered our face with reversal because aliens have entered our sanctuary. And by the way, Michael, that would have been a good thing to read during your alien show that you did about a week or two ago.
Well, look, I'm gonna do more of them, so I'll bring it in then.
Sweet. Yeah. So he continues this. For this reason, we the pious, all of us, have been looking everywhere, sometimes for water for the head and fountains of tears for the eyes, for lamenting this pitiable catastrophe, and sometimes for the wings of a dove, in the words of the divine David, so that we might fly away and announce these things to the sea that rules and presides over all others. I mean, your sovereign and supreme see. And obviously he's talking about Pope Martin and the Roman see. He says, in quest of healing for the wound inflicted, it has been accustomed to perform this authoritatively from the first and from of old, on the basis of its apostolic and canonical authority, for the reason evidently that the true great Peter, the head of the apostles, was deemed worthy not only to be entrusted alone out of all with the keys of the kingdom of heaven, for both opening them deservedly to those who believe and shutting them justly to those who do not believe in the gospel of grace, but also because he was the first to be entrusted with the shepherding of the sheep of the whole Catholic Church. As the text runs, Peter, do you love me? Shepherd my sheep. And again, because he possessed more than all others in an exceptional, unique way, firm and unshakable faith in our Lord, he was deemed worthy to turn and strengthen his comrades and spiritual brethren. And he's referencing Luke 20. When they were, I think Luke 20, I can't remember anyway, but when they were wavering, since providentially he had been adorned by the God who became incarnate for our sake with power and priestly authority over them all. So he just referenced the three papal quotes that Roman Catholics do. and applied it to Peter, and then applies it to the Pope, because the Pope has this prerogative, because he has it from Peter, because of those 3 passages. That's what we show. And then we're attacked because the Peter syndrome, or, you know, this whole idea of like keys. But here's a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church who did the same thing in reference to Pope Martin in his time. But not only that, it's in the context of there being a doctrinal issue in the church about, does Christ have one will or 2 wills? So this is a big deal. This is about dogma. This is a dogma that's affecting the Church Universal. And he's saying, we go to you because you have this authority, because you have it from Peter. So this whole idea, every bishop is a Peter, but not every bishop can have this be said about him, right? So it is true that every bishop is a Peter, but there are distinctions and ranks and levels of Peter. And when it comes to Peter being the universal teacher, that's where it resides in the Pope, then it's a different story, right? So we have to put these things in context. He actually goes on, and by the way, I'm referencing this from the Acts of the Lateran Synod 649 by Father Price, and these are page 143 and 144 that I was reading. But he goes on and he gets more and more explicit, but I don't want to just keep talking. But that was just an example I wanted to give of papal supremacy in the church.
Excellent. Did y'all have any other comments? Because I see a couple super chats I wanted to get to, and I think I got a caller on the line too. Let me do the super chats real quick, and then caller will come right to you. Did y'all have any other comments real quick before I get to them? Okay. Jonathan the Melchite, thank you for your super chat. He says, was the tradition of the Syriac Church of Antioch concerning the primacy and the prerogatives of St. Peter and his successors, the Roman pontiffs, by Syriac Catholic Patriarch Benham Beni in 1871, one of the books Suan read?
Yeah, that sounds like the source that was given to me. If it's like something that I should like, if there's something that I shouldn't be like, if it's an unreliable source, or if there's something wrong with it, I like to know, because I had a friend, send me that. But if there's something that I should know about it, then I'd like to know, because honestly, like I want to bring my A game to these conversations, and I want to give the Orthodox their due, and like I don't want to straw man or use bad sources. So, if there's something I should know about that source, please let me know.
The next one is from AD, confused as why Jerome says that all the apostles received the keys and not that Peter alone received the keys. Did you have any comments on that one, Swan?
I mean, I've discussed various arguments for why I think Peter singularly received the keys. Although he asked me specifically, like, why St. Jerome said that. I mean, we're going to have to look at the context and so on and so forth. But then Elijah just read a quote from someone who said that Peter alone received the keys. So then obviously you can't use solus patris, or else you get a contradiction, right? So, I mean, I guess, I don't know. So I've discussed a little bit on why I think Peter uniquely received the keys, aside from the fact that there are distinct parallels between him and Eliakim, right? Which would imply a singular possession of the keys. I've also talked about how even though binding and loosing and opening and shutting, like these powers are incredibly similar to each other. Like for instance, if Jesus had said in Matthew 18:18 and Matthew 16:19, and whatever you open, none shall shut, whatever you shut, none shall open. If he had done that, in 18:18 as well, then I can think you can do the backwards deduction and say, okay, yeah, so then the apostles have the keys, right? Because the keys are what give the power to open and shut. But when he says the power to bind and loose during first century, rabbinic Judaism, binding and loosing was a well understood metaphor during that time, and you didn't have to reference any keys or anything to understand the context. So, for instance, in Matthew 18:18, the reason why Jesus doesn't mention the keys is because you don't need the keys in that passage in order to understand the disciplinary function of binding and loosing. And moreover, binding and loosing was more associated probably with the binding and loosing of prisoners. I think I remember a source somewhere said about like the binding and loosing of scrolls, right? But it wasn't anything even close to the possession of keys, although there is a sense though in which opening and shutting and binding and loosing overlap. But I think that the distinction is strong. Like you can make the distinction that just because you have the power to bind and loose, that doesn't entail you have the keys in your possession. Now, and then I offered a counter interpretation about where I think in Acts chapter 15, you have all the apostles working with Peter, in a sense, possessing the keys, because they're participating in his ministry of opening the church to the Gentiles, which he said the Lord had chosen his mouth to do. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not too worried about that.
There's
My
something
2
else
cent.
to add to that. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, it's okay. I was just gonna say my 2 cent theory is that there's a unique way in which Peter receives the keys, and there's a more qualified way in which you could say all of them, and then there's even some cases in which it seems some fathers talk about everyone has the keys, the priests, and even I think Origen talks about the laity even having the keys. But I mean, all in very different senses, and I think that maybe accounts for some of these differences there in the fathers.
And Michael, one thing that I worry about, and people are using my Protestant background against me, and I thought that was kind of unfair. But anyway, like for instance, I know that a lot of Protestants, when they read, the Petrine epistles, they'll say, for instance, like Peter talks about the universal priesthood. So that means that we're all priests, so we don't need priests anymore, right? Or something like that. And then I'm like, this sounds like kind of like what some of the Orthodox are doing by saying everybody's Peter, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
There's
I'm
a
just
different sense, right?
Yeah, right.
There's a different sense in which we are all priests, the royal priesthood, as opposed to the sacramental priesthood, right?
Yeah, and then
it's just a lack of distinctions is what I generally run into, and so it gets a little frustrating.
And I mean, if I can say one thing too, real quick, like for instance, the throne of Moses or the seat of Moses. So I cited, for instance, the scholarship of Wolfgang Schrag in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, where he talks about how in general, like the seat of Moses was used to describe the authority of all the rabbis, right? But then Herbert Basser and Marcia Cohen, in their book, The Gospel of Matthew and Judaic Traditions, they talk about how the seat of Moses, however, could also be used specifically for the institutional sense of the Sanhedrin itself. So there was a sense in which everybody had the seat of Moses. There was another sense in which the seat of Moses was particularly applied to an institution or a set of persons. So either way, these distinctions are in Judaism, they're in the scriptures, and if we can talk about, for instance, why the universal priesthood doesn't entail no longer having priests, then I think we're at the liberty to at least make our distinctions as well on who possesses the keys.
Distinctions and nuance, my favorite words. Eric, on to you.
No, I was just going to make 2 comments. The caller that, or the audience member who referenced Contra Jovinianus by Jerome. If you read the context, he says that the keys are a common enterprise amongst all the apostles. But then he says one was selected to be their head, so that way, in a case of division, there would be no schism.
Mm-hmm.
So, right there, if you read the context of that passage where he talks about the keys at the common enterprise, he then gives a unique prerogative to Saint Peter, and then he gives a reason for that. He says Peter was appointed as head so that there won't be any schisms. Well, if Peter's given a unique role to be the head to avoid schism, that must mean he must have the power of unification. And to have the power of unification would definitely involve a unique aspect of the keys. The other thing I wanted to say was this is the book on the tradition of the Syriac Church, Antioch, and it's a mix of good and bad. So some of the citations are just laughable, but other ones are really good.
And callers, y'all hang on. We got one more super chat. Ryan Pope asks, and thank you for the super chat, to Suan, have you been able to do much analysis on the concept of Da'as Torah and how the Judaic conceptions of infallibility might be relevant?
So the phrase Das Torah, I haven't heard that one before. But then I think he said infallibility, correct?
Yeah, and in fact, I can pull it up. Well, can I still bring it up? Yeah, here it is. We bring it up on the screen. That might help. I've been able to do much analysis on the concept of Da'as Torah and how the Judaic conception of infallibility might be relevant.
Yeah, so I need to look into what that term is. I don't know if he's talking about the oral Torah. That's probably not what it is, or maybe it is. I don't know. But when it comes to like the concept of infallibility, that's basically what my entire summer is going to be dedicated to studying because, recently I was in contact with Craig S. Keener, and I've been emailing him and asking him for just sources on like the references to the infallibility of the High Court, or at least phrases in which, for instance, the rabbis will talk about how the heavenly court rules to the earthly court, or they'll talk about how if they can't settle an issue, then the earthly court will somehow intercede to settle the matter. And then, those are the kinds of things that I've been reading about. And then, as I mentioned before, the Shazal, that's something I've been looking into. But definitely, like, what my research is concerning right now is whether or not during the time of Jesus, there was this concept of infallibility, such that when, like, future New Testament exegetes look at the passages 16:19, 18:18 in Matthew, they can no longer just say, okay, this is just like, like heaven's gonna stand behind you, or like in that weaker sense, right? I want to see if like that stronger interpretation was there in the first century. That's my interest. Yeah, so that's all I can say at this moment, because my whole summer is dedicated to that question.
Trin Parsifal says that it's Da'at Torah. So,
okay.
Yeah. Well, caller, you're live with Reason and Theology. Can you hear us?
Hey, yes.
Thank you for
talk with you.
Yeah, thank you for waiting there. I appreciate the patience. So, what's your name? Who's your question for? And what is the question?
Well, for Mr. Sonna, he and I had interacted a little bit in chat. I don't know if he remembers. It was right after the debate, but it regarded the two messiahs, Messiah son of David and Messiah son of Joseph. And as well, it connects with the Syriac thing too, because these are the only fathers who use the Isaiah 22 passage. And as Eric said, the book by the Syriac Catholic bishop, it's kind of like, a lot of it's really bad. For instance, it says that it calls the Patriarch Ignatius when all of them are Ignatius after 1000 AD. But regardless, Mr. Sonna, what is your thought on perhaps combating your argument about Rome being taken over in this Jewish literature, when we could say this is something that was applied to Messiah, son of David, which is in reality the second coming of Christ?
Okay, so I think the first thing that I'm going to ask for some clarification on something, but I'll just start off by engaging what I can with the question, and then because honestly, I'm learning in this area too, so I appreciate, because for instance, I've been aware, especially from the work of Jacob Neusner, the idea of like the two messiahs, right? That was prevalent in some parts of Judaism, at least I think around the time of Christ. And when it comes to, so for instance, when I make the argument about, like, for instance, the Davidic kingdom or the conquest of Rome, what I'm trying to say is that we need to make our apologetic as strong as possible for Jesus, at least fulfilling as many of the Jewish expectations as possible without unnecessarily weakening our case. Right. So, for instance, like if particularly in my debate with certain Orthodox and Protestant, I've debated a few, just people online. The point that I'm making here, right, is that you and I both agree from our Christian background that Jesus is the son of David, that he is the Davidic monarch and final king of Israel. So then, why would you unnecessarily weaken the case, for instance, by saying, well, but Jesus didn't bring any earthly kingdom, right? When if we say that, then that would make our apologetic stronger to our Jewish brothers and sisters, or at least among the first century Jews, right? So I'm saying you don't want to unnecessarily weaken the case for your position. I think that would be an irrational choice. So then when you talked about the Messiah from the line of, or the son of David, right? You were saying that the Jews saw this as kind of an apocalyptic conquest of Rome. Is that correct? Like this would be kind of the end times, so to speak.
Well, in a sense, but more so that they saw these very different types of passages about the messiahs, and so they made one into a suffering servant and then one into a king, instead of what would end up being seen as proper by the church and as true, which was instead having two comings of the same Messiah.
Yeah, good. So and I do think that as Christians, we have to do at least some revision, right? In order to, for instance, combine some of the Jewish expectations, or make them more compatible with Christianity, right? So I acknowledge that you have to do some revision. But what I'm saying is you shouldn't like unnecessarily do that kind of revisionism, because then what happens is it start making your position look more suspect. So for instance, like what you want to do when you propose that your religion is the successor or the legitimate successor of another is that at least you pass on as much as what was already there in order to strengthen the apologetical case that your religion is a legitimate successor. And even like Jay Dyer in his debate with Shabir Ali, he made this point against Islam, that Islam doesn't seem to carry over what Judaism started. So I would just say the same here in the case of the New Testament and the New Covenant, and especially the Davidic kingdom. And I mean, we can talk about, for instance, some people view Jesus, I don't like this label, but sometimes people call Jesus like an apocalyptic Palestinian Jewish preacher in the first century. Some of the early Christians really did think that the end of the world was coming soon, right? So, I mean, there were a lot of things that were going on. But what I want to say is that I think that Jesus planted the seed for the eschaton in the first century. So that what we see now, just as, for instance, the Old Testament was kind of shadowing or pointing towards the New Testament, what I want to say here is that what Christ planted in the New Testament is also pointing towards his second coming and what that kingdom is going to be like. So then when the son of David is finally, so to speak, on the throne, the king of every single land, right, in a very visible public way, it's going to look a lot like the Davidic kingdom. And right now we see that with the office of prime minister. So it's kind of foreshadowing what is yet to come. So I just say that and there. But yeah, I mean, so is there anything else that you want to press on this particular matter?
Well, when you and I had interacted, I mentioned the Syriac fathers, but that was perhaps I shouldn't have done that though, because it wasn't like directly related. But the scholar, Father Robert Murray says he's the guy who converted Tolkien to Catholicism. He wrote in his book on Church and Kingdom, I think it's like page 238, that the Syriac fathers, who are the ones who happen to use the Isaiah 22 connection, that they were thinking of this with regards to their own bishop or their own patriarch, not particularizing any of this High Petrine language to Rome. And that's why Bishop Cyril's work, I should give him respect, that he sort of had to try to jump through hoops to try to affirm a special Roman primacy in the Syriac fathers. And so what are your thoughts on the Syriac fathers being the only ones who bring forth this about Isaiah 22 in light of that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, you mentioned important context when it comes to the Syriac fathers. And of course, like, I'm learning more about the sources that are in this debate. So I just want to acknowledge, right, that like I'm new to going beyond just the first 2 centuries, right? And as you know, a lot of my research has just focused upon, Judaism and then within living memory of the apostles and the first century sources. So then I feel like this is a question that might be more appropriate for one of my other, one of the other guys on the show. But I mean, yeah, I don't know if I can say much further on this. I mean, so I'd be interested if they exclusively said that about their local patriarch, or if all the sources that say something about the Roman pontiff, if those are all just like irrelevant. Because that book that I cited, although, as Eric said, it kind of has mixed scholarship, it does mention the Roman pontiff, right? So then I guess like I would just want to know, okay, which quote are we talking about? And are we saying that none of the things that the Syriac fathers seem to have been said to have been attributing to the Roman pontiff are actually like valid? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, certainly like what you're talking about, maybe that was going on, and I trust your testimony on that. So yeah, maybe that was going on. But then I'd want to also know, like, what about when they made these claims? Yeah.
Really quickly, because we got another caller over here too.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Father Robert Murray does note that even though they didn't apply this to Rome, they still knew about Roman traditions, such as St. Ephrem knowing about Peter's crucifixion upside down in Rome. So it's an interesting, note.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, yeah, I
well,
appreciate it. Yeah.
did you want to comment any further on that?
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for your call. Good stuff. Swan, if you wanted to make a final comment on that before I go to the next caller, go ahead.
No, I just want to thank him because, yeah, I mean, that's enough. I recently bought like a few books on like Jewish messianic theology in the first century. So I'm learning more about the theory of the two messiahs and all that. So I really appreciate that caller. I appreciate what he had to say. And I'm glad that I'm learning more about the sources at hand. So I really appreciate that call.
Caller, you're live with Reason in Theology. How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. And what's your name and your question, of course?
So my name is Bryson. I've called them before.
Yeah.
My question was going to be, for Suan, and I wanted to ask him: does he think that the Eastern Orthodox response to his position by invoking the Vincentian canon is appropriate? And I guess the follow-up to that would be: does he believe that, if not, would he say that his position predates that measuring stick because it's more rooted in a Jewish interpretation of Scripture and not something that comes in just with the New Testament and after with the Fathers?
Okay, yeah. So I had a little bit of a hard time like hearing clearly. So he said Saint Vincent.
Yeah, the Vincentian canon.
Yeah. Okay. So and then he made a second point about was it the Jewish sources or something predating? Sorry, I couldn't hear really
If you
well.
can clarify a little bit, Bryson, I'll turn you up a little bit more. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. So I was just asking, the follow-up question was, would you say that your position predates that measuring stick because it's rooted more in a Jewish interpretation of Scripture that would give more of a clarifying tool to the New Testament?
Okay, yeah. So in response to that one, I would say yes. But also aside from that too, like what you do as a historian is you try your best to like get the earliest sources possible on a particular matter. So if you can get primary, secondary, or sources within living memory, or what the scholars will call oral history, then that's really important to get at the heart of what was being intended or understood by the original utterances of the word. So for instance, I sometimes find it jarring because, I come from the background of like, studying from a New Testament historical perspective, like when people are citing people from the 5th or the 7th century that didn't have a connection, let's say, to anything from the 1st century, right? So they were kind of exegeting or commenting. I'm kind of like, okay. But then again, I don't dismiss them either, because I do know that scholars will cite like Jewish sources from the 13th century or the year one, or like in the, 1,000 years after Christ, in order to get at the heart of what was going on in the 1st century. But what I'm saying is that, I think it's important that you do that you do historically conscientious exegesis of the Scriptures, right? And that you go for the earliest sources, or those sources that can trace themselves back to the 1st century, right? So just an appeal, like alone, to someone 800 years later, like if you can show that that person has some kind of connection back to the 1st century, then that's something really important to be worth paying attention to, right? But if it's just them privately interpreting the Scriptures, then that's different for me.
Any follow-ups there, Bryson?
Okay. Well, no, I guess just thought wouldn't be another question, but the reason that I asked is because I just wanted to see if the perspective that you were giving would be something that you would say is more rooted in that and not necessarily, I guess you would say universal, in the sense that you see it pop up in a lot of the fathers' teaching, because I know a lot of Ubi's objections were based on, well, the fathers don't say this as explicitly as you do. So I wanted to try to get a response to that type of objection.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing is too, like, and I during the debate I offered all sorts of reasons why the fathers might not have said this, or even for instance, like, so this is kind of an anachronistic example, but bear with me. So for instance, St. Thomas Aquinas in his commentary on Matthew, he picks up on the Isaiah 22:22 connection, but then he says that that Christ is the rock of Matthew 16:18. And then, Aquinas was deeply influenced by Augustine. So then the point here is that maybe it's possible that some of the fathers, they just felt like we don't need to make any further comments about Matthew 16:19, right? Or maybe they were just like, well, other fathers have said things, so I don't know if I need to add anything new to the debate, right? Or even, I was talking to one of the world's leading New Testament scholars, graduate of Harvard and Cambridge, like a brilliant man. And I'll keep him private because this is a little bit embarrassing. But, I asked him, like, if he was aware of the Isaiah 22:22, Matthew 16:19 connection. And he said he had never heard of it before. And he was like a brilliant, brilliant man who read tons of sources. And then I started sending him like some of the, I started talking to him a little bit about the scholarship, and then, so he's aware of it now. But it's just like, sometimes these things just slip by people, and then when I saw that like this world's leading scholar hadn't heard of it before, I was like, whoa. So it even got beyond him, because like all these other scholars, were picking up on this. And even Patrick Gray in his 2017 Routledge Guidebook to the New Testament, he mentions the fact that many scholars now are aware of this parallel and like verify it. And even, you have citations from Craig O. Blomberg in a commentary on the New Testament use of the Old. You have Donald Guthrie in the 1970s, so, it's just, I guess some people pick up on it, some people don't. And, that's just how it sometimes works, and who knows why.
Well, Bryson, thank you for your call.
Much.
Yeah, excellent questions there. I don't see any other callers offhand, and nothing else in the chat. Not at least recently. If there were any questions earlier, they're buried at this point. So we'll go ahead and call it there. I wanted to first of all ask you one final question. Is that a Saint Benedict medal you're wearing?
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm.
Nice.
And
kudos.
The smaller one is St. Thomas. Yeah.
Okay, I was gonna ask what that is as well, but I figured that was Saint Benedict. That's awesome. And did you have any concluding thoughts or remarks or anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think like I just want to say first off that I'm really thankful to be on the show, and like I have so much respect for you guys, and I feel like the work that I'm doing here in the scriptures combined with your expertise on like the fathers, if we put this together, then like I think we have the whole package, right? So I wish that I could start moving on more to the fathers. And I like, and then the way that Eric kind of clarified what St. Jerome was saying, like, man, like if I had Eric during the debate, then it just would have been game over. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I don't know, maybe God doesn't want one scholar to be so powerful, right? He wants to distribute the power fairly or something. I don't know. But, yeah, so I'm really thankful. And I just wish that people would take the Jewish sources more seriously. And, I had someone text me after the debate, and he told me like, a lot of the guys who are hating on you, like he knows them, and he knows not all of them. Okay. So I don't want to make a general comment, but like there's a lot of anti-Semitism still, and that's really unfortunate. So like the fact that people didn't want to hear the Jewish sources or that sort of thing, I thought that was kind of sad. But yeah, like I think the new frontier in New Testament theology and scholarship is going to go back to the question, how did the first apostles see the relationship between Christianity, the church, and Israel? So like that question of what is Israel, especially now in the new covenant, that's become a huge subject. And I think that Catholicism, like it's way ahead of the game. And I'm glad to, be part of that conversation, and I hope to continue being part of it. And like I don't like being mean to, not mean maybe, but I don't like being so like tough with people sometimes, because like when they're being tough with me or they're saying like nonsense or like misleading people, like I have to jump in and kind of be like, guys, okay, stop, put my foot down. But like I'd really prefer, because I don't want to be a mean person, you know what I'm saying? So like I just want to have good, high quality conversations. And yeah, that's what I really want out of this. So I'm open to being corrected. I'm open to learning more. I don't, and as you guys know, like this debate can get really toxic and unfair and, uncharitable. And, I want to be the change that I want to see in the debate, and you guys are doing a good job on your end. So I just hope that we can have a more productive debate on this issue.
Yeah, here. I definitely second that. Well, Eric, Elijah, did y'all have any comments, final concluding thoughts, anything?
I was just going to say thank you, Suan, for coming on and sharing all that you've been learning. I was kind of surprised though that you did get into a debate with Ubi, because I thought they were only looking to get me for some reason. But I am happy that you were able to engage and had a good inception there. So maybe something in the future will come up where you could do this again and talk a little bit more about the fathers.
Elijah?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for coming on, Suan. This has been, a good lesson for me to learn all the stuff that you're teaching, because I'm weak on this whole typology stuff, and it's really good to learn. I appreciate the kind words, and last thing I want to say is just that you and Eric would make the best 1-2 punch on papacy apologetics. So.
All right. Well, once again, Suan, thank you for coming on. You're welcome on anytime. I look forward to doing it again. I think I'm going to be on your show pretty soon, right?
Yeah, I got you and Elijah coming on sometime.
Yeah.
Although separately, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What are y'all talking about, Elijah?
Of course, yes, sir. We're allowed to, y'all.
Okay, that'll be fun. Yeah, good stuff. I look forward to that. When's that going to be?
Is that May 8th, I think?
I got to look at my schedule. Yeah, I think I have like you and Michael. I have you and Elijah like back to back. So or like you one day and then next day back to back.
Okay, cool, awesome. Well, yeah, looking forward to both of those. Yeah, so again, thank you for coming on. Like I said, you're welcome on anytime. And everybody, of course, thank y'all for commenting there in the chat. Thank you for your questions, the calls, all that good stuff. Don't forget to, of course, comment, like, subscribe, share this on your social media. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support us. Till next time, God bless you all.